The U.S. Army in World War II. Northwest Europe introduction. These who hit Omaha and Utah beaches on the 6th of June 1944 were members of the finest equipped mechanized army ever assembled. As Allied, and particularly American strength continued to build up in Normandy, the threadbare but still potent Wehrmacht soon came to realize they had an elephant by the tail. After the August breakout from Normandy and the landings in the south of France, the ever more powerful U.S. armies aggressively pursued the Germans across France, in a classic demonstration of exploitation warfare. Even so, in some quarters there was still some jealous questioning as to the professionalism and endurance of the lavishly supplied and self-confident G. Some British and German leaders, harking back to the U.S. Army's blooding at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, wondered if the Americans would prove to have a glass jaw when the going got tough. This was not, it must be said, a doubt harbored by any who had seen the fighting in Normandy from close up, from either side of the front. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 would be the test. Heavily attacked by superior German armor, outnumbered and without air support, the U.S. Army was on its own in the Ardennes. A large portion of the Green 106th Division held its position for a short time and then gave way in the biggest U.S. surrender since Kasserine. The surprised Americans bent, but did not break. Bastogne was stubbornly held, and Germany's finest remaining panzer troops were constantly bedeviled by skilled U.S. delaying actions. By the 1st of January 1945, the Wehrmacht had suffered crippling losses without even approaching their objective, and the line was soon restored. The Battle of the Bulge had proven the battle-worthiness of the G, and was, in Prime Minister Churchill's words, truly an American victory. Supply crisis in the Edo despite America's apparently limitless manufacturing capacity and generous scales of issue for almost every necessity. One factor had a baleful effect on U.S. operations and on the daily conditions faced by many U.S. soldiers throughout NW Europe in the second half of 1944. The problem was not producing what was needed or shipping it to Europe. It was getting it out of the ships and up to the frontline units when, where and in the quantities required. The overall supply situation in the ETO was poor, due in about equal measure to shortages of transportation and bad decisions on logistics taken by the staff at SHAEF Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces. Eisenhower's staff had planned for a steadily progressing advance with their allies reaching the German border in early 1945. This would give time to clear the ports in western France and to move supplies forward in a timely fashion. While the battle for Normandy ran behind schedule, the leap across France in August to September 1944 quickly outran all logistical planning. With the now distant ports still slow to clear, supplies continued to come in over Omaha Beach. The Red Ball Express priority trucking route, so named for the red mark used in the 1930s on priority railroad cars, gave some relief, as did the use of aircraft for cargo runs to the front. Railroads would have been the most efficient means of transport, but France's network, ripped up by Allied bombing in the weeks before D-Day, took a long time to rebuild. The opening of southern French ports after the Anvil landings in August made some difference, but the failure of the British or Canadian 21st Army Group to seize the estuaries at Antwerp, the greatest port in the Low Countries, left the Allies logistically adrift. The grand pursuit across France by the 1st and 3rd U.S. Armies, and by 21st Army Group in the Netherlands, ground to a standstill in September, and each of the Allied Army commanders sought to pressure SHAEF into granting him priority of supply as they argued over the conflicting strategies of narrow thrust and broad advance. Such absolute basics as ammunition and gasoline became critical items. Eisenhower opted to bring ashore more combat units, but the transport to move them to the front was already consumed in running supplies to meet existing demands. Some 60 to 100 cargo ships collected off Cherbourg, waiting for dock space, and in September it began to get rainy and cold. Stocks of gas, ammunition, blankets, tires, and winter uniforms all became critically short. The new buckled combat boot was now being issued, and it was felt that if treated with dubbin it would serve well enough as a winter boot for France. The war, however, was in Belgium, on the German border and in the Vosges Mountains. The new boots were found to have little capacity to resist water or give warmth. With the Battle of the Bulge raging in December, winter overshoes and shoe packs became a priority. During that month, the U.S. Army in the ETO lost 56,000 men to non-battle causes such as frostbite and trey. Foot. By January 1945, these losses were almost equal to battle casualties. Winter boots finally arrived in significant numbers by late January. Overcoats and the new M1943 four-pocket combat jackets were also in short supply, since they had not been ordered or brought forward from the Rear Area Communications Zone (COMZE). The winter of 1944-45 also caught the U.S. Army with few white camouflage suits, reversible anoraks available at the front. White cotton bedsheets were pressed into service, cut and sewn by local civilians, QM and the Gs. Besides whitewashing vehicles and helmets, some men actually oversprayed their uniforms and equipment. Hooded snow camouflage suits finally began to appear in January. With the rapidly approaching spring, the demand for such special items receded, and the Belgian ports also began to open. Service dress enlisted men. The U.S. Army started the war wearing the M1939 four-pocket drab brown 18 ounces wool serge coat and trousers for service dress class. Until the issue of the M1941 Parsons field jacket, this was also intended to be one of the Army's field uniforms. The coat had two patch breast pockets and two inside skirt pockets, both with flaps. The back had biswing shoulder gussets, belt hooks, and an integral cloth belt across the small of the back. A russet leather belt with plain brass bar buckle was to be worn with the coat until its deletion in 1941. The open lapel front of the tunic closed with 1-inch diameter brass buttons bearing the eagle seal of the U.S. Half-inch eagle buttons were used for the pockets and epaulettes. In 1942, a simpler M1942 coat without a biswing back became the standard issue. Rank insignia CMA 347 for NCO's rank insignia chart were sewn on both sleeves above the elbow in OD green on black felt. Silver on black stripes were also used. The four-pocket coat was made limited standard in September 1944 in favor of the M1944 wool field or Ike jacket. Creased wool serge trousers M1939 were worn with the service coat, usually of the same or a slightly lighter shade of drab brown. In the UTO, the drab, long-sleeved wool shirt was worn initially with a black but more commonly with a khaki necktie. The shirt had two breast pockets with clipped flaps and a button front and cuffs. With the issue of the slightly darker Ike jacket in 1944-45, both the older pants and newer matching equivalents were to be seen. Russet leather ankle boots or shoes were worn with the four-pocket service dress. With the new Ike jacket, shine buckle boots were commonly worn. Trousers were tucked into the boots paratrooper style, or worn loose with low-quarter shoes. Most shirts and pants were made with an extra length of material behind the buttonholes. This gas flap would supposedly protect the skin against blistering agents. A brown drab visored or saucer hat with a russet leather visor was the initial issue service dress hat. A flat side cap with overseas or garrison cap in brown drab and summer, tropical khaki versions was soon authorized and became the standard issue. Initially, the edges of the turn-up flap were curtained round the base of the cap were piped in branch-specific colors, and a regimental crest or branch of service collar disc was sometimes worn on its left front. Piping soon became optional, and unpiped caps were commonly seen. The popular overseas cap was cheap, light and easy to pack. It acquired a nickname based on the female anatomy. A Pfizer's M19 for officers' hip-length tunic coat was generally similar to the enlisted version. It used a wool parathea material of approximately 15 to 26 ounces weight, with a softer feel than the enlisted man's wool serge. The color can best be described as a dark greenish to chocolate brown, officially OD 51 dark shade. The breast pockets were pleated. The M1940 had biswing or pleated back seams and four brass buttons down the front. The M1942 coat eliminated the biswing back and replaced the bottom button with a smooth plastic one, which fitted under an integral cloth waist belt with a slip-through brass buckle, replacing the Sam Browne. Officers' tunics also sported a half-inch wide drab cloth braid on each cuff. Warrant officers wore the same tunic with greenish cuff braid. CMA 342 for officers and warrant officers' insignia. Beige khaki trousers or breeches called pinks were to be worn with this tunic. Russet brown shoes, khaki shirt, and black early or khaki necktie completed the uniform. This outfit was sometimes called pinks and greens, and it was said by some British and rueful jest, given their own clothes rationing, that Yank officers were obviously not as rich as everyone said, if they couldn't afford to buy uniforms with matching trousers. A limited number of BDs were issued to the Americans, and their warmth, and the neat appearance which could be achieved with the waist-length two-pocket blouse, was well liked. U.S. senior officers were presumably judging not by the coarse serge other ranks issue blouse, but by the privately tailored versions worn by their British counterparts. By regulation, U.S. general officers are given a wide latitude in personal dress. Gen Eisenhower especially liked the short blouse, and had a sort of American version tailored for his own use, with a tighter fit and smoother cloth than the serge original. The ETO staff then began to push for an American version, and in 1943 the ETO quartermaster brought out the first model. This was essentially a version of the M1941 Parsons field jacket but made of the same rough, heavy textured wool serge as the BD, warm and easy to care for. It featured exposed plastic buttons, hand warmer pockets with flaps, a buckle across waist tab and biswing back pleats. The second model to be produced looked more like a standard British BD blouse, with exposed plastic buttons, flap patch breast pockets, epaulettes and a biswing back pleat. The ETO jacket was not an uncommon sight, particularly among Air Corps units in Britain. The QM in the States could not get the rough BD wool serge, but was making its own plans for a short blouse-style jacket. M1944 Ike jacket based on recommendations from the ETO. The QM in the USA designed a short version of the four-pocket service coat. This new jacket was made from a slightly darker drab material. Matching trousers with flapped rear pockets were also manufactured. The jacket had epaulettes, two pleated breast pockets with pointed flaps, button cuffs, all buttons concealed, and a belted waist with take-up buckles on each hip. And like the British issue BD blouse, but like the ETO jacket, it also featured open lapels. The QM intended for this jacket to serve as both a field and service jacket, replacing the four-pocket tunic. Gs were supposed to have it loose-fitting for field wear, and to use it as a liner under the M1943-4. However, the Gs had other ideas. They had it tailored tight and wore it almost exclusively as a service jacket. This wool field jacket first began limited issue in mid-1944 and was an immediate success, being universally nicknamed after the general who had shown the way. Because of limited availability, many Gs based in England had their four-pocket service tunics cut and retailored into a brass-button version of the short Ike jacket. After V-Day, Gs were issued the M1944 jacket almost exclusively. Rank was worn on both sleeves. Insignia were an OD green on black felt, silver on black, or, more commonly, the newer green on black version. An officer's version of the Ike jacket was produced in dark green, a chocolate OD shade 51, and was worn with appropriate insignia. The officer's cuff trim was usually in a dark shade. This jacket, of which custom-tailored variations were also seen, was worn with either matching trousers or pinks. Branch colors and insignia. Each branch within the U.S. Army had its own distinctive color. This color was only normally seen on flags, in some of the embellishments on officers' dress blue uniforms, in the cord piping on the curtain of enlisted men's overseas caps, and in the cords of the old campaign hat. Each branch also had its own collar insignia. For officers, these were of cutout design, normally in brass but in some cases with additional colored enameling. Chaplains' insignia were silver. They were worn on both lower lapels of the officer's service coat, below cut-out U.S. national ciphers on the upper lapels. When in shirt sleeve order, the branch badge was pinned to the wearer's left collar and the rank insignia CMA 342 for chart to his right. Enlisted men wore the national cipher and the branch insignia on brass discs on the right and left upper lapels respectively. The colors and insignia of the major branches normally encountered in combat zones are described in the table on page 8. Distinctive insignia. Many units were authorized to wear heraldic-style crests in colored enamels, which were sometimes displayed in the TO on the officers' and enlisted men's service dress when out at the line. They were displayed by officers centered on the service coat epaulettes, top inwards, and by enlisted men on the lower coat lapels. EMS could also pin one to the left front of the overseas cap. Shoulder patches. During the American Civil War, the Union Army began to use cloth identification patches, distinctively shaped for each corps and colored for each division, and normally worn on the headgear. The British Army used many complex systems of distinctive sleeve patches at battalion, brigade, and divisional level during World War I. These battle badges were normally geometric shapes in solid colors, identifying units within a formation by their color, shape, and number. General Pershing also authorized the use of shoulder patches within the American Expeditionary Force in France, but the war ended as they came into issue. These differed from most of the British systems in being actual insignia rather than systems to identify units. By World War II, the use of such patches officially, shoulder sleeve insignia, within the U.S. Army was common. A division used a standard patch throughout its organization, usually based on the previously designed World War I patch. In general, these were embroidered multicolored patches, worn at the top of the left sleeve. The symbols used ran the gamut from heraldic designs, through visual references to the home state, to punning plays on words. Independent units, corps and armies also used patches, as did the Army Air Corps. Corps patches were normally blue on white, and commonly used Roman numerals. Those G is not assigned to specific divisions usually wore corps or army patches. Airborne units displayed an additional airborne title above their patch to show their status. They also wore a parachute, glider, or later a combined patch on their overseas caps. All armored divisions and independent tank battalions used the triangular armored force patch divided red, yellow, blue for the antecedent artillery. Cavalry and infantry branches differed by divisional and unit numerals. It was only after V-Day that they began to add strips to the bottom of their triangular patches bearing their nicknames, the 2nd Armored Division's Hell on Wheels being among the first seen. Patches were machine embroidered onto khaki cotton cloth. Original World War II patches sometimes show the khaki around the edges and have a soft off-white rear surface. Some patches were fabricated overseas by local tailors, and bullion embroidered versions were sometimes available. Guests who served in combat with more than one organization were authorized to wear the patch of their original combat unit on the right shoulder of the service dress, at the same time as the current patch on the left. Fourragères in World War I, both the 1st and 2nd Infantry Divisions were awarded the right to wear a fourragère or French-style left shoulder cord, in the green flecked with red of the Croix de Guerre ribbon, as a collective decoration to mark their service to France. In World War II, members of those divisions were also authorized to wear it as a remembrance of their forebears' service, but this was rarely seen. Actual World War I veterans still in service sometimes wore the fourragère, however. During World War II, the French began once again to award the fourragère to U.S. units. The great majority of these awards were made near the end of the war. When seen worn by G's, the cords tended to be of the old World War I issue. The fourragère for the World War II Croix de Guerre had a slightly different coloration, of red flecked with green, and was in particularly short supply. Post-war G's were both kinds. Availability of these items from ruined and only recently liberated France was naturally disorganized. There were two design variants. One was a simple plated cord, intended to be worn from the left epaulette button down the back of the shoulder, passing forward under the armpit and fixing by a loop to a front button, with a hanging brass ferrule. The other, more elaborate version had a long extra length of smooth cord which was supposed to be arranged under the epaulette so as to hang on the outside of the arm into loops. And knowing G's did wear them on the correct shoulder, but in any number of ways. These cords were also awarded by the Belgian and Dutch governments. The red-green Belgian Croix de Guerre fourragère was worn on the right shoulder. The orange cord of the Dutch Wilhelmsorde was worn on the left, passing into the breast pocket. Examples are illustrated on Plate H. Most units seem to have been semi-officially notified of their authorization to wear these distinctions soon after V-Day. It commonly took until the 1950s for the official orders authorizing these awards to be confirmed. Women's Army Corps Women's Army uniforms were almost universally condemned for their poor fit and appearance. By V-Day, however, they had some of the most practical and best-looking uniforms of any of the women's services. The 1942 drab service dress for enlisted WACs consisted of a hip-length tunic with 4 brass buttons in the same drab brownish color OD shade 54 as it had scallop-flapped internal breast pockets and plain slashed lower pockets. A skirt reaching to just below the knee, and the stiff-billed hobby hat were both in matching drab brown. See also May 342, Plate B2. A russet brown shoulder purse was issued to be carried with this uniform. WAC officers wore the same general style of uniform as the enlisted women. Their coat and hat were made of wool. Barathea and the Army officers dark green, a chocolate color OD shade 51, and worn with a skirt made in the color of officers' pinks. The first coat issued had transverse shoulder straps and an integral belt, The later model had normal epaulettes and no belt. In service dress, WACs wore sensible russet brown lace low-heel shoes, and sometimes brown gloves. With the 1943 enrollment of the auxiliaries of the WAC into the regular Army, the new Women's Army Corps dropped their walking buzzard insignia in favor of the standard U.S. Eagle. They retained the use of the Athena head branch insignia, though many WACs serving with a specific branch, e.g. the Air Corps, wore that collar insignia instead. In late 1940 for WACs in Europe followed the current fashion, receiving a specially designed Ike jacket with a matching skirt, trousers, and an overseas cap of more curved shape than the men's C-plate D1. This jacket was modeled on the G-issue field service jacket, both with and without breast pockets. It was made in both enlisted drab and officers' dark green chocolate colors, and proved very popular. Like the men's version, the wax short jacket soon became the standard issue for the G-Jane. An off-duty dress was authorized in 1940 for consisting of a fairly plain-looking, long-sleeved, knee-length dress of wool crepe. This came in both beige summer and dark khaki winter colors. It had concealed buttons, a belt, patched breast pockets, and epaulettes. Basic branch insignia were worn on the collar. A standard-issue drab or matching beige overseas cap was worn with this dress. Army Nurse Corps ANC was an auxiliary organization originating in the Spanish-American War. These nurses were essentially contracted medical professionals who were, like the WAC, finally given full Army status in 1943-44. They started the war wearing a dark blue tunic and skirt service uniform. Their working outfit was the classic white dress with nurse's cap and blue wool cape with red lining. They also used a seersucker white and brown striped work dress with insignia. In 1940 for the ANC converted to the standard WAC uniforms available at that date. Standard officer insignia were worn, with a branch emblem of a brass caduceus with a superimposed black N. Most nurses were second lieutenants, but were paid less than their male Army counterparts. Nurses had a plain beige off-duty dress. This was in fact copied by the WAC above. The front of the nurse's service dress hat was similar to the WAC hobby hat, but the back was rounded to the crown. Organization Corps, Armies, and Army Groups. A corps consisted of a minimum of 2 divisions. In the order of battle of the U.S. Army in the TO in 1945 we find about 18 corps, with uncertainty over the exact number lying in the presence of a number of divisions under direct command of an army. Most of these corps had 3 divisions. Some 4, 1, 5 and 1-16 corps of 15th Army had 6. A representative example is Gen Walker's the 20th Corps of 3rd Army, which comprised 4 divisions of the 4th and 6th Armored, and 76th and 80th Infantry. In addition, a corps normally had many independent units of tanks, artillery, engineers, and other specialists under direct command. An army was formed from 2 or more corps. 10 armies were formed for service in World War II. The 2nd and 4th Armies were stationed in the U.S. and consisted of divisions under formation. By 1945 the last of the divisional units based in the U.S. had left these 2 armies and were headed for the front. The 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies served in France, Belgium, and Germany. The 7th Army served in Sicily, the south of France and Germany. The 5th Army was stationed in Italy. The 6th and 8th Armies served in the Pacific, with the 10th formed on Okinawa. As an example, in 1945 Gen Hodges' 1st Army consisted of 3 V-7 and the 18th Airborne Corps and totaled 17 divisions. Army groups were formed with a minimum of 2 armies. In 1945 the 12th Army Group Gen Omar Bradley consisted of the 1st and 3rd Armies Gens Hodges and Patton. The U.S. 9th Army Gen Simpson was traded back and forth between the 12th and the British or Canadian 21st Army Group Gen Montgomery. The 6th Army Group Gen Jacob Devers consisted of the 7th Army Gen Patch and 1st French Army Gen de Latre. The 15th Army Group Gen Mark Clark was made up of the 5th Army Gen Truscott plus all the other Allied forces in Italy. In the Pacific, Army units served under theater commanders Gen Douglas MacArthur and Adam Chester Nimitz. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces SHAF commanded all ground forces in Europe Gen Dwight Eisenhower. Rotation of divisions in World War I. Entire divisions were withdrawn from combat for periodic rest and rebuilding. In the Pacific in World War II, the short, violent battles for island groups and the time lag between invasions helped accomplish this rest cycle for Marine and some Army units. In the Mediterranean, Sicily fell in 30 days, and the preparations for the Salerno and Anzio landings gave 5th Army units a reasonable chance to rest. In the ETO, and later in Italy, this cycling of units for rest was the exception. Once a division was committed into combat, it was expected to stay at the front. During the war, the 1st Infantry Division spent 442 days in combat, of which 317 days were served in the ETO. In France and Germany alone, the Big Red One lost 206% of its strength to casualties. 85 to 90% of this loss was from the 3 infantry regiments. During the 2nd Infantry Division's 314 days of ETO service, it lost 184% of its strength. Among those infantry divisions which entered combat in Normandy and fought through the 11 months to V-Day, the average loss was about 200% of establishment. This rate of casualties had a terribly wearing effect on units, and gave the ever-dwindling handful of old hands an even more fatalistic view of their fate than usual. As the war dragged on, it seemed that only $1 million round was going to get a G out of the war with all his limbs. The exception was the Airborne Force 82nd and 101st Divisions. They did suffer severe losses, and were kept in the line for longer than they should have been after D-Day, but they were pulled out of the line to keep them available for future airborne operations. Replacement's giant olive drab machine needed a constant flow of additional troops to keep up its strength. The EF in World War I solved this problem by disbanding about every 4th Division arriving in France and redistributing its men. In World War II, the Army refused to allow this, and depended on individuals sent from the US to fill the gaps. Emphasizing its machine-like viewpoint, the Army called these men replacements. In 1944, the number of men individually trained for posting as replacement parts rapidly fell short of the needs of the ravenous armies in France. The units based in the USA were soon mercilessly plundered. This weakened these training units, and sent bewildered replacements forward to units with which they had no connection. The semi-trained Gs lurched through the system until they arrived at forward replacement depots, called Repel-Depots. Here combat-experienced Gs, sent forward again after recovering from wounds, mingled with the green replacements for days or even weeks as they awaited new assignments. The savvy veterans wanted to return to their old units, and commonly went AWOL absent without leave to hitch a ride forward. Whereupon their old outfits looked the other way and gladly took them in. The fresh replacements were ushered in small groups to their new units, usually in the front line and in the dark. Friendless and almost untrained in surviving this deadly environment, they were killed and wounded in droves, often still anonymous to the Gs of their platoons. In historian Stephen Ambrose's Citizen Soldier, he says of the Repel-Depot system, had the Germans been given a free hand to devise a replacement system for the TO, one that would do the Americans most harm and least good, they could not have done a better job. General Norman Cota, who distinguished himself in combat as second in command of the 29th Division on Omaha Beach, considered it both foolish and downright cruel to send a green young man into action in this way, robbed of the psychological support of buddies he had trained with and leaders he knew. The authorities slowly realized the brutal and wasteful nature of the system, but did little to improve it beyond changing the name replacements to reinforcements. Some divisions took it on themselves to introduce reforms. However, they began holding replacements back after their arrival for raid training by veteran NCOs. These men were then hopefully introduced to their new units out of the front line, with a chance to get to know, and be known by, their leaders and comrades. These replacements had a much higher survival rate, and more quickly became assets to their units. In May 347 we mention the 10,000-odd African-American soldiers of non-combat units who volunteered for infantry service in response to Gen Eisenhower's call during the manpower crisis of winter 1944-45. Other classes of recent civilians and soldiers were also rushed forward to swell the ranks of the rifle companies, including deferred college men ASDP, surplus air cadets, and Gs stripped out of anti-aircraft, tank destroyer, and other support units. These were intelligent and sometimes seasoned men, making the quality of replacements received at the end of the war surprisingly superior. Artillery. Historically, Americans have been a technically minded people. As early as the 1840s, the flying artillery of the Mexican War earned a high reputation, and at most periods, including World War II, the artillery has been the most effective branch in the U.S. Army. The artillery suffered far fewer casualties than the infantry, and this contributed to its level of professionalism and cohesion. The quality of its mostly redesigned and sometimes motorized guns was about average for the period, but U.S.-developed fire control and ammunition made all the difference. Ammunition was first-rate and usually in good supply. By German standards, U.S. employment of artillery was lavish. In part due to its availability, U.S. leaders were much more willing to expend ammunition than men. The introduction of air-bursting V-2 radar ammunition in late 1944 made the U.S. guns even more deadly. With the use of forward observers, light spotter aircraft, and telephone radio communications to tie them together at a fire direction center FDC, they had an equal potential to coordinate their fires, creating a specially devastating time-on-target TOT technique. TOT was executed by mathematically coordinating different guns at different locations to land their shells on target at exactly the same moment. The FDC's accuracy and speed in calculating the complex mathematics was aided by a US-developed artillery graphical firing table GFT slide rule. 105mm howitzer war began with the Army using both the old French 75mm howitzer and the newer M53 and 75mm gun. By 1943, the 75mm was rapidly disappearing from all but anti-tank work. The M105mm howitzer soon became the most common U.S. artillery piece of the war. It had a range of 12,200 yards 11 kilometers, 7 miles, and used high-explosive He, white phosphorus WP and smoke ammunition. The towed gun with shield weighed about 2.5 tons. The 75mm and 105mm shared the same carriage. The 105mm was also mounted as the M7 Priest self-propelled gun, based on an M3 Grant tank hull and weighing about 25 tons. The M7 had a 7-man crew and was also armed with a 50 cal machine gun and a kind of forward pulpit, thus its name. It was first issued in 1942 and over 3,000 were ultimately built. Pack howitzer 75mm pack howitzer was developed after World War I as a light field piece that could be broken down and packed by 6 mules in rough terrain. It was also modified as a horse-drawn weapon. By World War II, the 1.1-ton M3 pack howitzer was issued to infantry units to fill out their cannon companies, in which role it was commonly used in the Pacific. An airborne M8 version weighing 1,300 pounds 590 kilograms was parachuted or glidered for use by the artillery units of the airborne divisions. A larger 105mm pack howitzer weighing 1.3 tons was available by 1944. Its accuracy left something to be desired, and at 8,300 yards 7.6 kilometers. For 0.7 miles its range fell about 1,000 yards short of that of the 75mm. Used in the Pacific, Italy and in airborne operations, the little pack guns did yeoman service. Heavy artillery based on the French 155mm GPF gun, the 155mm gun howitzer also proved a very successful weapon system. Note that both the 155mm and 8-in artillery pieces came in different howitzer and longer-barreled, longer-ranging gun versions. The new M1 155mm howitzer weighed 6.4 tons and its He, WP and smoke shells had a range of 16,300 yards 14.9 kilometers. The longer-barreled M1 155mm gun weighed 15 tons and could fire He and AP shells over 25,000 yards 20.8 kilometers, 14.2 miles. Some of the older M1918A1 155mm guns were mounted on M3 Grant hulls as M12 self-propelled artillery. After limited use in North Africa, 6 battalions were belatedly fielded in Normandy. It was guessed that the guns would be useful for direct fire operations against fortifications, and indeed they made short work of all but the stoutest, as well as providing general indirect fire support. Due to availability of British ammunition, a 4.5 inches gun was also built to supplement the 155mm. This was slightly heavier than the 155mm howitzer at 6.6 tons. And its 55 pounds ammunition did not have the hitting power of the 155's 95 pounds shell. The Heavy 8-in howitzer shared based on the image provided. Here is the transcribed text. The 155's gun carriage weighed about 15 tons and had a range of 18,500 yards, 16.8 kilometers, 10.5 miles. Independent Corps artillery battalions were usually armed with 155 mm long tom, 4.5 inches and 8 inches pieces. Super Heavy Artillery siege gun version of the 8 inches gun weighed 35 tons, used by both the U.S. Navy and Army. It fired shells weighing over 200 pounds, 90.7 kilograms to ranges of up to 35,000 yards, 32 kilometers, 19.8 miles. The G's learned that if they drilled a small hole through the shell fuse, it caused a satisfying screaming sound as the round went down range. The 240 mm howitzer weighed 32 tons and could fire its 360 pounds 163 kilograms, around 25,200 yards 22.8 kilometers, 14 miles. Both the 240 mm howitzer and the 8 inches gun used a wheelless split trail carriage. They were employed for the first time in the defense of Anzio. These weapons were later transferred to France for use against the fortified port cities. Rockets. Mindful of the success of the Russians and Germans in deploying rocket-propelled artillery, the U.S. also fielded rockets in late 1944. The 4.5-in finned rocket was used with limited success in saturation bombardment missions. The rockets were mounted on truck beds or on the turrets of some unhappy Sherman tanks Model T-34. As the rockets had a large launch signature, it was expedient for rocket units to shoot and scoot. Anti-tank guns. In 1939, production of the M3 37mm anti-tank gun began. This was generally based on the German 37mm, and over 20,000 were made in 1,900. This drop breech gun weighed just over 900 pounds, 408 kilograms, and was used both as an AT gun and in the M3 and M5 Stuart tank series. It could fire AP, and a very useful canister grapeshot round. The 37mm was adequate for use against Japanese tanks, but by the time of its deployment against the Germans in Tunisia it was ineffective. By 1940, for the 37mm was only to be seen in the Pacific and in U.S. light tanks. The need for a heavier AT gun led to U.S. production of the current British 6-pounder 57mm. The US M1 57mm weighed 2,700 pounds 1,225 kilograms and fired AP or HE rounds, and was known for its vicious recoil. Some 16,000 had been made when production ceased in 1944. Although it continued in service throughout the war, it was obsolete for its work by that date. The M5 3 inches 75mm artillery piece was used for anti-tank work with good results in Tunisia. With a redesigned gun shield, this 2.5-ton piece gave effective service until V-Day. The M290mm AT gun used in the M36 tank destroyer and M26 tank was also built as a split-trail towed AT gun, but none reached combat before V-Day. Anti-aircraft guns. The US began the war with the M23 AT gun and a new M190mm gun. Also quick to come online was the CR-260 at 584th radar fire control system. M290mm gun with gun shield was produced in 1943, which could be used for both AT and AA fire. The combination of radar guidance and the VT fuse made this AA gun extremely effective. The M2 weighed 16 tons and could fire up to 34,000 feet 10,360 meters, 6 miles. A 120mm AA gun was fielded in 1945 that could fire over 47,000 feet 14,325 meters. For tactical AA defense, both the water and air-cooled 50 cal machine guns were used, as was the M1 US version of the British 40mm Bofors gun. The M16-17 half-track mounting quadruple .50s. In an electrically powered Maxim turret was the most common AA seen at unit level. Some 3,500 were built from May 1943. A towed trailer version of the quad mount, and an M15 half-track with 250s and 137mm gun, or less common. Tactical air support. Air forces naturally tend to see their roles as fighting for air superiority and attacking strategic targets. Ground troops are only marginally assisted by such operations. The German Blitzkrieg of 1940 had demonstrated that aircraft could also be used as mobile artillery, but the U.S. Army Air Corps was reluctant to be tied down to directly supporting ground actions. This to some extent negated Allied air superiority over the battlefield, and in Tunisia and Sicily it was usually the Luftwaffe that did the strafing and fighter bombing. By 1940 for Air Corps Gen Quaysad a plan to rectify this failure in the TO by assigning special teams of airmen, including experienced pilots, to accompany spearhead ground units as liaison officers. The 9th Air Force had 7 tactical fighter-bomber groups, each usually of 3 squadrons, and 1 Fotorechi group, specifically tasked with supporting the ground troops. Each Corps division, Armored Combat Command, and Mechanized Cavalry Group headquarters had an AF radio team. Tactical air liaison officers rode radio-equipped jeeps and sometimes tanks with forward units, vectoring the P-47s onto immediate targets just like artillery FOS. Ground-fired smoke and WP rounds were also used to mark targets for the aviators. This tighter coordination between ground and air became a critical part in the success of U.S. ground operations. It was also over the objections of the Air Corps that Elfer Piper Cub Grasshopper planes were procured for scouting and FO work. By 1940 for the coordination between the Grasshoppers and the artillery was such that the appearance of this low, slow, flimsy and unarmed light aircraft could paralyze an entire German sector. Engineers Combat Engineer Battalion assigned to each division was an important and valuable asset. They received some of the most rigorous training in the Army. Engineers were generally well armed and provided with 50 cal machine guns and flamethrowers as well as mines and explosives. They were responsible for the bulldozers and bridging equipment so vital for breaching obstacles. Considering the multiple skills displayed by the engineers, it was the common joke that at least they were learning a trade. In Normandy, the engineers blasted holes in the massive banked hedgerows and, along with ordnance, welded the column-pronged hedgerow-busting devices to the fronts of tanks. The following winter the 1,128th Engineer Combat Group in Bastogne and engineer units throughout the Bulge repeatedly proved themselves key players in delaying and stopping the German spearheads. The bulldozer was essentially an American invention, and it proved a lifesaver in building and maintaining the logistical link between the front lines and the supply depots. In the Pacific it was the dozer that created resupply lines and airstrips in the jungles of New Guinea and the Philippines. Some bulldozers were fitted with an armored cab because of snipers, and for obstacle clearance under fire dozer blades were also fitted to Sherman tanks. A major mission of the combat engineers was dealing with mines. Both the U.S. anti-tank M1A1 and anti-personnel mine were considered. The following text is a transcription of the provided image, which describes the equipment and tactics used by combat engineers and infantry during World War E. Adequate but underpowered. The Hawkins mine was a light device capable just of blowing the track off a tank, and was used primarily by airborne troops in Normandy. For mine location and lifting, the CR-625 mine detector was used. This could find metal mines buried up to 18 inches deep. It was fragile, however, not waterproof, and required the operator to stand exposed while using it. Probes or bayonets carefully shoved into the earth at a 30-degree angle, by G's inching forward and making a fingertip search of the ground ahead, were a common if nerve-wracking expedient. The Japanese rarely used buried mines, but the Germans frequently employed them. For anti-personnel work, the German S-mine or bouncing Betty was commonly encountered. Once set off by a 7 pounds-foot pressure, the initial charge blew the mine about 4 feet into the air before the bursting charge sent the shrapnel filling scything in all directions. The smaller shoe mine was made of wood and thus difficult to detect. Its half a pound to 2 pounds charge was capable of shattering a man's leg and blowing off his foot. The Teller mine was the powerful German anti-tank pattern. Many of these mines were booby-trapped when laid to prevent their extraction. The GIs did not envy the combat engineer his job. In addition to mine detection, engineers also used explosives themselves. The British-developed Bangalore torpedo was a 5 feet long, 2 inches diameter pipe filled with 8.5 pounds of ammonium nitrate explosive. Bangalores were pushed ahead on the surface of the ground to clear obstacles, as well as cutting wire entanglements, their primary purpose. They could set off concealed enemy mines by sympathetic detonation. A disadvantage was that nearby mines which were not set off by the explosion would commonly become tenderized, i.e. very sensitive and hazardous. Sections of pipe could be fitted together to lengthen the charge. A larger version called the Snake was also used. Other explosives used by combat engineers included Primacord Detcord and half a pound or 1 pound blocks of TNT. Bridging was another primary function of engineers. Pneumatic raft pontoon bridges were common, as was the use of the British-developed prefabricated steel girder Bailey Bridge with a 40-ton loading capacity capable of carrying tanks. The Bailey was quick to put in, but erecting it was found to be a difficult and dangerous task for the engineers. The U.S. Army was slow to embrace the Bailey, although it revolutionized the deployment of tactical bridges. It should be noted that the Army accepted the Corps of Engineers' requirement that tanks have a limited width and weight 30 to 35 tons to match existing tactical bridging capacity. This limitation further slowed the development of a heavier modernized tank. Tanks development and characteristics of U.S. tanks in World War II is a vast subject covered in detail in many other publications for 2. See the inside back cover. The following brief notes are intended only as a very basic introduction. M for Sherman. The majority of U.S. vehicles of the 1940s were gasoline petrol powered and mechanically very reliable. Unfortunately, tanks using gasoline as opposed to diesel fuel are more likely to burst into flames when hit. The German and British nicknames for them for Sherman, Tommy Cooker and Ronson after a popular brand of cigarette lighter, were significant. Over 60% of knocked-out Shermans burned. The greatest factor in the initial detonation was loose or unprotected stowage of main gun ammunition, however. Nevertheless, the Sherman series was the best tank available to the Western Allies in early 1942, and faced by the vast task of outfitting not only U.S. but also Allied armies. America kept the Sherman in production throughout the war. It weighed between 30 and 35 tons, mounted a short 75mm gun and 2 or 3 machine guns, and had a crew of 5. Maximum armor thickness was 50mm hull and 75mm turret. In the constant race with German designers, U.S. tanks rapidly fell behind in both armor protection and main armament. By the time of the Tunisian campaign, the Sherman was already being outclassed by the new long 75mm gun mounted in late models of the German PZKW-4. But U.S. tank losses were written off as due to poor training and tactics, soon to be corrected. The Sicilian and southern Italian campaigns saw minimal tank versus tank action, and the U.S. Army landed in France in June 1940 for expecting the Sherman to do well against the opposition. The actual experience of the crews that first trapped in the tight country of the Normandy Bocage, where the defending Germans had all the advantages, soon produced a tiger psychosis. U.S. tanks were unable to inflict or survive significant damage in straightforward confrontations with the German 75mm PZKW-V Panther in most battle ranges, or at virtually any range against the massive 88mm PZKW-V Tiger. Comparatively speaking, the Allied types were both undergunned and underarmored, sometimes chronically so throughout the war. Thin armor on tank destroyers and Stuart tanks, and barely adequate armor on the Sherman, is evidenced in many photos by the piling of sandbags and extra track plates on the hull fronts. This was nothing more than a band-aid to make the crew feel better. The provision of extra plates welded to the sides over the ammo stowage areas was of more help, as was the water jacket wet stowage fitted to some Shermans. The M4A3 Jumbo, which appeared in autumn 1944, was a Sherman with frontal armor protection essentially doubled, placed at the front of tank columns to act as an anti-tank fire magnet. It was successful, but only 254 were built. As well as having guns with about twice the effective range of the US 75mm, the Panther and Tiger were massively armored. Despite the introduction of the 76mm Sherman in mid-1944, tanks with the new turret only replaced about half of the 75mm Shermans with frontline battalions before V-Day. The 76mm gun had better armor penetration but a weak shell, no WP round, and left room for the stowage of 30% fewer shells. Although some generals including Patton were unconvinced of the need for the new gun, after the 76mm Sherman reached the front it was a high-demand item, and many 75mm tanks were retrofitted. Units sometimes borrowed the new high-velocity armor-penetrating HOP ammo or Hypershot from M18 tank destroyer battalions, giving their 76mm Shermans 50% more penetration at under 500 yards. Even so, the 76mm often scuffed rather than penetrated the heavier German tanks. Only the appearance in small numbers of the 90mm M36 tank destroyer in late 1944, and of M26 Pershing tanks in 1945, theoretically gave American tankers the edge. However, other factors outweighed the bare mathematics of armor thickness and gun power. U.S. tanks had speed, mechanical reliability, radio coordination, fast gun loading and turret speed on their side as well as sheer numbers in the field. Centrally, the decision to standardize the versatile M3, M4 and M10 hulls, drivetrains and suspensions also gave U.S. ordnance a huge edge in ease and speed of manufacturing. Large numbers of variant models, from self-propelled artillery to armored recovery vehicles, were produced on these basic chassis. The U.S. production of Shermans alone to 57,000 by July 1945 represented twice the total tank production of Germany and Britain combined. Luckily, there were never very many Panthers or more than a handful of Tigers on the battlefield. U.S. armor commanders adapted by bringing the coordination of superior numbers, artillery and air power to an unequaled level as a force multiplier. The provision of good radio communications should not be underestimated as a factor in this success. Every U.S. tank had a receiver SCR 538 and Leader's tanks, and by 1945 most others had transmitters and receivers SCR 508 528s. The Sherman platoons maneuvered to ambush the Panzers, fired WP rounds to blind the enemy, flank or back shooting them from short range, playing cat and mouse in cover, and relying on speed and numbers in breakthrough battles to make the most of their equipment. It is a tribute to the American crews that they were able to fight the U.S. tanks through the 1940–45 Edo campaign and win essentially every major battle. After the German retreat from France in late summer 1944, there was a steady shift, in the U.S. Army's favor, in the level of skills shown by German versus American tank crews. Most U.S. tanks were given standard model designations, e.g. M for medium. The British, who were heavy users of U.S. tanks, had a tradition of naming the types, and gave them American generals' names, Stuart for the M3 Light, Grant and Lee for different versions of the M3 Medium, and Sherman for the M for Medium. The G's adopted most of these names, and the Army began officially naming tank models by the end of the war. The crews commonly grew attached to their vehicles and sometimes named them individually, usually using the initial letter of their company, i.e., Biko, Betty, Barbara, Beauty, etc. M26 Pershing. Development of the M26 Pershing heavy tank was suddenly given high priority in autumn 1944. Weighing 46 tons and mounting a 90mm M3 gun, it was capable of knocking out most German tanks. The Pershing began arriving at the front by February 1945, the 3rd and 9th Armored Divisions receiving the first limited issue. By V-Day, of the 700 built, 310 were in the TO and 200 of these were in combat units. Some M26s arrived in Okinawa in August 1945 too late to see use.